In this last section, we're looking at livelihood rights. Now, livelihood rights are one part of social rights. You can see livelihood rights as they're expressed in Article 11, food, clothing and housing. But really what's happened now, as we'll talk about soon, it's mainly food, housing and water. Now, these go alongside education and health to form social rights. So Article 11 says everyone has a right to an adequate standard of living for himself. It's gendered language, but that was the time of the 1960s. And his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the conditions and to the continuing improvement of living conditions. So looking at these livelihood rights, firstly, the right to clothing hasn't really been acted on. There's no international NGOs in that area. There's not a lot of advocacy in that area because it hasn't seemed to be, a serious issue. It can be in some cases when people have no clothes and the weather's very cold, but primarily that then becomes a right around, the right to housing. So it's not really acted on that much, and so clothing tends to be dropped. But what has been added is water, because since the 1960s, when this was drafted, or when this was adopted in the United Nations, we know that clean water has become a huge issue with the growing population, increasing pollution, and increasing use of that resource. Means that water is not nearly as available as it was before. Now, it's defined by the treaty body to ICESCR that water is kind of considered as a part of food, but it's also a part of health as well. We need water, obviously, to drink, but also to wash ourselves and for sanitation and to be healthy. So there is a right to water, which is considered part of this. Now, these livelihood rights are kind of like basic needs in the sense of food, water, and shelter, but there is a distinction. So the right to food and the basic need of food are different. The basic need of food is, 2,200 calories about a day to survive. Whereas the right to food is to have food which you can eat, which kind of treats you as a human being. So that means a sustainable source of food. It means the food that you're kind of used to eating, and it means that you eat that food in a way that humans normally eat it as well. Same thing with the right to housing and the right to shelter. Shelter can be a tent in a refugee camp, but that's not housing. Housing is housing appropriate for a human to live in, which is according to their needs and their safety and security and culture and so on. Okay. And so we see that there is a link, but also a separation between basic needs, which are humanitarian, and livelihood rights, which are human rights based. And of course, these all link to health and education, but in this case, we're just looking at housing. We're actually going to look at education and housing and food. Now, in terms of how they're assessed, because what do we know exactly what the right to housing means? It's the right to housing that everyone should have a 3-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms and a place to park their car, or is it just a cardboard box under a bridge? Same with education. What is actually the human right to education? Now, what's tended to be used is this model called the 4A model. And the 4A model is used specifically for education, but it can kind of link, and it is adaptable to the other livelihood rights as well. But these seem to be the 4 key elements of these livelihood rights. So the first one is that resource, is that right available? Is there enough of it? Is there enough education? Is there enough health? Is there enough food? And so on. Now, just because there may be enough doesn't mean everyone can get access to it, because the next question is it accessible? Because people can maybe not get access because it's too expensive, so lack of economic access. It's too far away. The school may be 20 kilometers away, so it's not physically accessible. Or they're denied accessibility because of discrimination. Because you're a girl, you can't go to school. Because you're from this ethnic group, you can't access government food supplies or whatever. Now, the next A is acceptable, which is about the quality of that product. Because just because you may get access to food or to education, it could be very poor quality. So there is also a part of the right to livelihood rights is that it is of a necessary standard. The water is clean, the housing is sufficient, there's enough, the food is right to eat. Now, the last right is also that these elements should be adaptable to the specific needs, and that can be adaptable to, say, people with disability or ethnic minority groups, or that it kind of adapts and changes over time to keep in touch with what's going on in society. And that can be, for example, education should be teaching about computers, or maybe housing, the right to housing may include access to the internet, and so on, which means that those rights have to be able to adapt and change, both to different needs from different groups, but also different changes in society. So let's look at what this looks like. Firstly, with education. So a reminder, of course, primary education is minimum core, but high school and university are progressively realized. Okay, so high school being available and accessible is progressively realized. And so just because a kid can't get to high school may not be a violation, but there should be more and more available high school spots, and they should be more and more accessible to different people. Also, with the right to education, that education should have a purpose of the full development. Another important part of that right is that parents have rights over the children's education. But then looking at the standards, the 4A model, and this is a bit to go through, but just kind of quickly, we say, is it available? Is primary education free and compulsory? Are there enough teachers and materials? And is the school, does it have the necessary features to ensure that it's available for kids? And that includes bathrooms, or bathrooms for girls, or a library, or books, or is it going to be safe? All these are kind of elements of availability. Is there just enough schools there or spaces in that school so a kid can go? Next is accessibility. And that's questions around discrimination. Are kids being discriminated so they can't access school? And maybe that's because they're a minority group, or they're disabled, or it may be based on gender. You have physical accessibility. Is it close enough? Economic accessibility. Is it affordable enough? But also importantly, in terms of education, it's accessible in terms of what documentation that you need. Because a child should not be forced to produce documentation. We know that in many countries, producing birth certificates or other kind of documents is needed before a kid can enter school, and that should not be the case. Primary school should be free and compulsory no matter what. It doesn't rely on, say, a birth certificate. Next is acceptability. That is of a certain standard, and there are lots and lots of measures of the acceptability of education coming through, staff-student ratios, the schoolroom being of a certain acceptability, having enough resources there, whether it's books or pens or pencils. Is the quality of the education tolerant? Like, are they learning things which is going to be useful for them? Are they learning not to have discrimination, or not to have racism, and so on? Other elements of acceptability. Then in terms of adaptability, we're talking about, can that school adapt to specific needs of students, where that could be language needs for different language speakers, or disabled kids, or a variety of different, making sure that all kids can get taught at that school. Also adaptable to ensure that the school does address some of the problems that children may face. So the kids can go to school rather than going to child labour, or not be forced into marriage, or not be forced into work. Is it adaptable to ensure that girls get access? Is it adaptable to ensure that it's keeping up with what education should be about? So you see that 4A model kind of then breaks down the different elements of education into those components. So you can look at, you can then have an understanding about, is the right to education met using those 4 criteria, the 4As. Similar, we have the rights to housing, though it's not quite in the 4A model, it's a bit different. Remember, in housing, there's 1 billion people without adequate housing. We have huge problems of lack of tenure or forced evictions in the region, particularly Cambodia and Myanmar, but most countries have problems of forced eviction. Now, in terms of the duty of the state should progressively realise all people have housing, which means dealing with homelessness, or dealing with people living in, say, illegal or temporary shelters. The state should have a housing policy. I see some states have very good housing policies, like, for instance, Singapore, where there aren't that many homeless people. We see other countries, there are significant problems of homelessness, say Japan and South Korea. The state should have rule of law then on housing, land and property to ensure that people have their security to live there. Now, the variation on the 4A model for housing is this kind of the 7 elements here. Now, these elements come out of a general comment made by the Economic, Social and Cultural Committee some 10 or 20 years ago, and they kind of have 7 key elements. Legal security of tenure, which means that people are protected where they live. Availability of services, materials and infrastructure, that can be water and electricity, the kind of things needed to make sure the house can be maintained and the house can be kept. That the house is affordable, so economic accessibility. That it's habitable, meaning it kind of keeps the wind and the weather outside, and it's enough space for the people to, good enough quality for the people to live in the house. So it's more of a quality one. It's accessible, which means it's accessible to health and education, and accessible for people that may have a disability. Its location, and this is a bit like it overlaps with accessibility, but location means it's located near those services. Accessibility means that people can get access to the house. And the last one is it's culturally adequate, because different cultures, we know that Europeans and Thais and Cambodians and Indonesians, often they have different kind of housing cultures and housing needs. Same with indigenous groups. It could be that, like say, children have different bedrooms to adults, or the bathroom and the kitchen, how they're set up. But that the housing should kind of address those cultural needs. Now, the last one we're looking at then is the right to food. So, food is critical, because we know that famine and starvation occur not because of not enough food, but they're caused by politics. That often it's, whether it's acts of discrimination or acts of conflict, that starvation occurs because of that. We also have problems of hunger and malnutrition in the region, in areas, say, of maternal care. So people who tend to be the most malnourished tend to be young mothers, because they can't get the necessary food as they're bringing up a child. There's also other kind of significant concerns about food, and such as things like, we used to think it was starvation as a problem, but a problem now of poverty is obesity. People only getting access to cheap, poor food, which makes them obese or overweight. Additives in foods, like the GMO debate, which may not still be around nowadays, but also other kind of preservatives and chemicals. Or how things like the Nestle breast milk scandal changes people's diets and people's health. This occurred back in the 70s, but there are still concerns about some of these milk companies trying to take kids off, or young babies off breast milk and onto formula, which may not be the best thing. This is all managed through the FAO and their idea of food security, which is also part of the reading. And then we also know that we still have hunger in the world because of things like discrimination. We won't go through this in detail, but things also like poverty, with trade and food prices going up and down, malnutrition or poor food quality or lack of access to food, through kind of conflicts and emergencies, and also through environmental change, where food may not be available for some groups. So coming to the main elements, and this is the final slide, looking at the right to food. We know minimum core is freedom from starvation. Progressively realised as sustainable food sources in an economic system which ensures people have access to food. Now, the actual 4A elements here, again, a bit similar in some ways, but also different in others. So that food is available is the first one. Then it looks at physical and economic accessibility. Now, in terms of the quality elements, we're talking about meeting dietary needs. So it means it has the necessary minerals and calories and nutrients and what else is needed. And also that it's free from adverse substances. It's not going to make people sick. So that's the kind of, the food is both good for your diet and it's not going to make you sick. Then lastly is a cultural consumer acceptability of the food, that it's food which people know how to eat and know how to cook and like to eat and like to cook it. So these seem to be the key elements here of right to food. Now, the main takeaways from this in terms of livelihood rights is that people often complain, well, the right to food or the right to water or the right to education, it's not justiciable. We don't know what it actually means. But there has been work to kind of break down what they mean, to identify these key elements of is it available, is it accessible, what are the key elements of quality there. So while it's still got to be kind of specific according to the culture or the context of where that right is being analysed, it is possible to look at a situation to kind of determine, is the right to food or the right to health being met in this situation. And with that, we'll finish this. This will be the last section of the last lecture for ICESCR.